Module 5, Japanese Internment in World War II. Now, the internment of the Japanese after the bombing of Pearl Harbor occurred because a number of people were afraid or concerned that those with Japanese ancestry would cause harm to the war effort. And so, Executive Orders 9066 and 9102 were signed by FDR to move those with Japanese ancestry from the West Coast to internment camps. Now, these executive orders also included Italians and Germans, but only the Japanese were interned. Now, again, the idea here was that people were very afraid, and they thought that this was the best way to deal with the situation and get out of their fear of what could happen. And an example of what they of this fear, or how they were presenting this, or how they were talking about this at the time, can be seen in the following newsreel, kind of discussing the internment, but putting a positive spin on the situation.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of them American citizens, one-third aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move. This picture tells how the mass migration was accomplished. Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved. First attention was given to the problems of sabotage and espionage. Now, here at San Francisco, for example, convoys were being made up within sight of possible Axis agents. There were more Japanese in Los Angeles than in any other area. At nearby San Pedro, houses and hotels occupied almost exclusively by Japanese were within a stone's throw of a naval air base, shipyards, oil wells. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. So as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these. But of course, this limited evacuation was a solution to only part of the problem. The larger problem, the uncertainty of what would happen among these people in case of a Japanese invasion, still remained. That is why the commanding general of the Western Defense Command determined that all Japanese within the coastal area should move inland. Immediately, the Army began mapping evacuation areas and for a time encouraged the Japanese to leave voluntarily. The trouble for the voluntary evacuees soon threatened in their new locations. So the program was quickly put on a planned and protected basis. Thereafter, the American citizen Japanese and Japanese aliens made their plans in accordance with Army orders. Notices were posted. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register. They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration. Civilian physicians made preliminary medical examinations. Government agencies helped in 100 ways. They helped the evacuees find tenants for their farms. They helped businessmen lease, sell, or store their property. Now, this aid was financed by the government, but quick disposal of property often involved financial sacrifice for the evacuees. Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort. In small towns as well as large, up and down the coast, the moving continued. Behind them, they left shops and homes they had occupied for many years. Their fishing fleets were impounded and left under guard. Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all. The residents of the new community set about developing a way of life as nearly normal as possible. They held church services, Protestant, Catholic, and Buddhist. They issued their own newspaper, organized nursery schools, and some made camouflage nets for the United States Army. Meanwhile, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere, quarters were being built where they would have an opportunity to work and more space in which to live. When word came that these new homes were ready, the final movement began. At each relocation center, evacuees were met by an advance contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity. Here they would build schools, educate their children, reclaim the desert. Their own physicians took precautions to guard against epidemics. They opened advanced Americanization classes for college students, who in turn would instruct other groups. They made a rough beginning at self-government, for while the Army would guard the outer limits of each area, community life and security within were largely up to the Japanese themselves. They immediately saw the need for developing civic leaders. At weekly community meetings, citations were given to the block leaders who had worked most diligently. Special emphasis was put on the health and care of these American children of Japanese descent. Their parents, most of whom are American citizens, and their grandparents, who are aliens, immediately wanted to go to work. At Manzanar, they built a lath house and began rooting guayuli cuttings. The plants, when mature, will add to our rubber supply. At Parker, they undertook the irrigation of fertile desert lands. Meanwhile, in areas away from the coast and under appropriate safeguards, many were permitted to enter private employment, particularly to work in sugar beet fields where labor was badly needed. Now, this brief picture is actually the prologue to a story that is yet to be told. The full story will begin to unfold when the raw lands of the desert turn green, when all adult hands are at productive work on public lands or in private employment. It will be fully told only when circumstances permit the loyal American citizens once again to enjoy the freedom we in this country cherish, and when the disloyal, we hope, have left this country for good. In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency. And we won't change this fundamental decency no matter what our enemies do. But of course, we hope most earnestly that our example will influence the Axis powers in their treatment of Americans who fall into their hands.
Now, the spots in green showcases the areas in where the internment camps were located. Those of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast were moved from their homes to any one of these camps, and in doing so, losing possession of their homes, businesses, any belongings, losing large amounts of wealth and financial well-being as a result of this. Now, if you recall the earlier video, again, the U.S. government attempted to, again, try to put a positive spin on this, but the reality being is that there was no evidence that Japanese Americans had any interest in or any likelihood of causing any problems. That much of this activity due specifically to the fear individuals had, and the result of this led to again, many people questioning the motives to this day. The following video would showcase really the actual living experience and actual issues Japanese and Japanese Americans faced within these internment camps.
You know, it's a very humiliating experience to be rounded up by your own government. It was very painful because you not just were cast as enemies, you lost everything materially.
After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the United States government decided Japanese Americans were enemies of the state. Within months, over 100,000 U.S. citizens and legal residents were ordered to leave their homes and report to one of 10 remote internment centers. Manzanar, in the high California desert, is one of those internment camps.
No, this is Janice. And
that's Jess. That's
this you. Oh.
Yeah, little fat kid. This was in Manzanar. And it looks like, what, do you think maybe it was 12 months old?
Yes.
And then this is Janice and Mom with the bear behind.
Oh, yeah.
If you look at our pictures, every group of folks that are being evacuated were all dressed up. Can you imagine being ordered to come into camp and
wearing their best clothes?
Yes, wearing their best clothes. And being,
coming early.
Yes,
right,
and being on time. And being on time. It is absolutely asinine when I look back on it. And if it were to happen today, oh my, I would raise such hell.
Mom, we need more Spam?
Here, I'll get it for you.
My father never saw me. My mother was pregnant with me, and he gave up his citizenship and left with his family to go back to Japan. And my mother was not going to give hers up.
Not me. I said, I'll join the waves, the wax, anything, but I sure am not leaving America.
800 volunteers from the Japanese American community came up here, including my uncle, to build the barracks. So they dressed in their finest, they showed up early, and they built the barracks where they were to be housed. The barracks were cobbled together out of scrap lumber and tar paper. There was no insulation. There was no privacy because they were just these 20 by 25-foot boxes.
Prefabricated barracks spring up. It's in no sense a concentration camp, but a city with its front yard in the snow-peaked Sierra Nevadas. Here, eventually, 12,000 will live and work.
I came to camp when I was almost 10 years old. We left early in the morning. It took us 9 hours to drive here. And when we got here, it was really dusty, and it was nothing but just barracks there. So it was very stark. It was like being abandoned, yeah.
I think when you come out here and you feel the heat and you see the dust, and some years it's very windy, the dust is going up your nose and your hair is just flying everywhere, you know, you really kind of can appreciate what the people went through.
Where the Japanese Americans lived was basically 1 square mile, and it was enclosed by a 5-strand barbed wire fence. There were also 8 guard towers. Security was really high, very tight.
One thing I'll never forget my grandmother telling me is that when they first got here, my great-grandmother would sit under the apple orchards and cry and sob that she couldn't give her children a better life, that she couldn't provide them the opportunities that she wanted to.
There you go. Okay? In the hooky lineup. Camp was boring, there's nothing to do. We had to leave everything we had behind, so you made whatever toys you could make out of the material you had on hand. We had no other options. We were stuck behind a barbed wire fence. So we made the best that we can out of it. My older brother, he heard one day about some of the guys said that they went fishing in the local creek. So we'd climb under the barbed wire and leave camp. We never had permission to go. We just snuck out of camp by ourselves.
The war, of course, ends in August 1945, but the camp didn't close until November 21st of 1945. And that is because a lot of the people who were here had nowhere to go.
Camp life was really bad because we were in captivity. We couldn't do what we wanted to do. But a rougher life, a more devastating part of my life history is when we came out of camp. Because in camp, you were fed 3 times a day. You had the necessities of life.
Before the war, Setz Tomida's father had a thriving trucking business in Southern California, and the family lived comfortably. When they left Manzanar, they had no home, no money, and faced rampant prejudice. The only job Mr. Tomida could find was cleaning rabbit pens.
And the place to live was a 2-car garage. All it has was 1 single light bulb. No water, no heat, no electricity, no gas. We had 2 beds, and 9 of us slept in that room there. So you talk about harsh conditions. Camp was okay compared to that.
When the community emerges from camp, with many people dispossessed of all of their possessions and livelihood and houses, they had to bury the pain and anger and frustration in order to survive.
For years, even mentioning the internment experience was taboo among Japanese Americans. Finally, in 1969, 250 students and activists returned to reclaim their history. Now, thousands make the annual pilgrimage to remember past injustices and raise awareness of other civil rights struggles.
We're here to continue the legacy, bringing friends of the community together to remember what happened at Manzanar in hopes of something like this never happening again.
My mother became connected to these young students and this Asian Pride movement and came back to Manzanar in '69. And Manzanar became bigger than life over the course of the next year or 2.
Sukunatomi Embry was really the driving force behind the creation of Manzanar Historic Site. She began organizing the pilgrimages and, you know, for almost 40 years was involved in preserving this site. She was very patriotic, not someone whose patriotism was sort of mindless nationalism, but defending your country and making your country stand for what its Constitution says it stands for.
I want people 50 years from now to remember what was there. Although it was a negative place, we want to turn it around to be positive, so that people will always remember that America is a democracy. Sue Kunitomi Embry.
After that first visit, Sue Embry threw herself into the cause. The next year, she brought her children.
So here I am, 11 years old, 12 years old, and I get to come to Manzanar, to the next pilgrimage, and we pull up, and I look around and I said, well, where's Manzanar? And I'm thinking, what the heck? All this excitement, all this animated discussion, all this time, and there's nothing here. There's desert.
After the war, the camp was quickly torn down. If not for a small monument built to honor Manzanar's dead, no one would know the camp had ever existed.
No one ever dreamed we would have a park. No one ever dreamed we would have the national government take responsibility for this, and many people didn't want them to. There were large numbers of even former internees that felt that, why are you bringing this up now? It's in the past. It's going to call unnecessary negative attention to us. There's people out there that already hate us. Don't give them more ammunition.
For 2 decades, Sue Embry and others pushed the government to commemorate the site. Finally, in 1988, Congress issued a formal apology and paid $20,000 in reparations to every surviving internee. 4 years later, the Manzanar National Historic Site was established. At the end of every pilgrimage, former internees tell their heart-wrenching stories.
The infant mortality inside the camps was 10 times higher than outside the camps. So, I mean, you know, that's incredible. To believe that children were deemed as dangerous to this country.
My family lived this. I imagine my grandmother with 5 children, you know, teens, on down to my mom who was 3, which is the same age my daughter is now. This can't happen again, ever.
My dad had tractors, he had trucks, we had 2 cars. He must have been doing fairly well financially. And then, of course, the war started and everything came to an end. And that's how I'm sure many Japanese families were affected. It was just totally devastating.
Other civil rights activists share their stories, too.
My wife, they always harass her, tell her to go back. This still goes on.
As a Muslim American, I've been discriminated so many times because of stereotypes that have been presented by the media. People telling me, I saw it on MSNBC, I saw it on this TV, you know, literally.
You had to speak out because nobody spoke out for us. And it makes a difference.
These kind of things are going on now. And I think we tell the story because we really feel our country, I don't think they've learned much about prejudice.
A lot of people think of the national parks as the great natural areas and the great recreational areas. But I think one of the really neat things about the national park system is that we also preserve our history. And not just the glowing parts of our history, but in some of the newer parks, like Manzanar, like some of the civil rights sites, we are actually talking about some of the not so wonderful parts of our history.
Roots were pulled up, people's lives were altered forever. It was an important part of our history because we have a constitution and it says that we have rights. And these people basically were told that it doesn't apply to you.
Having Manzanar as a part of the national park system allows people to come and learn about this chapter of history. And I think it gives people an opportunity to think about their own civic responsibilities and what we can each do to help America live up to its promises.
How the government treats the citizens, that's our story. So I think if we don't have that conversation, we're not doing what we should be doing here at Manzanar.
We want to shout to the world that we are a great nation willing to say that we are sorry about what we did. And not only are we a democracy, but we work at it, for all of us. The working at it is the important part. Sue Kunitomi Embry.
It wasn't until 1945 that those living in those camps were allowed to leave. And in doing so, they were just given $25 and a train ticket, and that was pretty much it. Any any reimbursement to any lost belongings, property, and so forth uh, were no longer was not offered. And on top of things, they experienced still much prejudice and discrimination in society. Now, one Japanese American did try to fight this. Fred Kuramatsu sued the policy, and went straight to the Supreme Court. However, the court at the time in 1944 supported the president's ability to make such decisions by a 6-3 majority. And the quote that the majority has from Justice Hugo Black: "Pressing public necessity may sometimes justify the existence of such restrictions." We will see similar explanations for policies when we look at other examples, but this became unfortunately far too common way of looking at policy. However, the situation didn't end there. It wasn't until many years later where you have a number of individuals, mostly from the family, children, grandchildren of those who were interned, who learned about this. In many instances, those who were interned didn't want to talk about it. They felt shame about it. But there were those in the family, and then those and others began to view that the United States government needs to apologize and provide compensation for the treatment they experienced of being interned. So in the 70s, we really see the start of the redress movement, and then we have also in 1988 you have the Civil Liberties Act, which again publicly acknowledged that internment was resulted from the racial intolerance faced by Japanese and Japanese Americans. And then at the time, President Ronald Reagan provided $20,000 for each surviving detainee, and so that amount reached about $1.2 billion for that. So there was, to a certain extent, redress for this specific incident, and we'll be looking at others and other situations, and which will have different outcomes. But in this case, for this community, they were able to achieve something from the result. Alright, so here's something to think about, because we will be discussing this in class. and discussing this in other instances. But does wartime or similar times of crises require this kind of activity where you seek to curtail people's rights for any reason? Now, the question becomes: do you try to curtail it for the entire population, or in this case, can you do it specifically targeting a single group within the larger population?